Yes, good morning. So today we are half-half. One half is sitting in the lecture hall and the other half is coming to us via the internet. Yeah, what have we last week started? We started to talk about, so to speak, the worst aggregate indicator in order to describe the economic performance of a country without all other economic indicators, so to speak. So, of course, GDP can be highly criticized because it is a highly aggregated variable. And today we will see what do we count and what we cannot count within GDP. But anyhow, there is also, in my opinion, no better way to do it. And then if we talk about economic growth and if 2% growth of Germany is good or bad, then of course we always have to keep in mind that we cannot calculate everything what we want, and not everything is represented in a number of 2% growth of industrial countries or something like this. Okay, so GDP. The definition, gross domestic product, is the total market value, and these are the first two important words, total and market value of, and this is also very important, finished. What do we count? Goods and services produced within one country. Last time we already talked about domestic concept and national concept. In order to repeat, the domestic concept for Germany then means something like this: for defense around Germany and count economically everything what we are doing within a specific period. Generally, if we talk about GDP, then we talk about 1 year, but we have also data for quarters of the economic performance in a country. And national concept, this was if we count everybody who is German, who is French, who is citizen of the United States, and what these people or companies are producing. This for the difference and the repetition from last week between domestic product and national product. So then we want to go inside all these small or little words: total, market value, finished, goods and services, country specific, time. So what is, oh, this should be, I have written there, of all, total market value of all, this one. There has to be the circle. So what is market value? Market value is for many goods, we have prices. If we go to the supermarket, we can look up the price for a liter milk or something like this. And then for 1 year, of course, then we look how much milk for which prices we have bought last year. So everything this enters the gross domestic product. So for every goods and services where we have market prices, of course, we value these goods and services with market prices. But then there comes the first problem. We also produce many goods and services, and especially in the public sector where we don't have market prices or where we do not have really a functioning market. And if we don't have market prices, then we have to estimate, because still we want to count all finished goods and services. And in order to estimate this, then, like in business administration, there we have to have an idea which price, with which price I can go to the market. And where do I get the idea from? I get this idea from my production costs. So then I look, when I don't have market prices, I look at the costs of the production. And this then I take as an estimator for this good. And with these production costs times the quantity of these produced goods, this enters the GDP. And especially in the public sector, we have many, many services. And of course, there many times we don't have any market. And then we can say the main production factor in the public sector for public services are just the wages, for example, for myself. Because here we are at a public university, and then these services are valued with mainly the wages of the people working in the public sector. So this we quite often have to do, that we have to estimate something. And then also we want to count all. And there, take for example a flat which you own by yourself. Then of course you don't pay any rent. But you use, of course, during the last year, this flat. And then of course we also need an estimation for the value of this flat you use by your own and you own by yourself. And therefore, we also just look at the average rent in the market. And although you don't pay any rent for this, we value your flat with this average rent. And this is also something you quite often do in business administration. This is something like opportunity costs. If you have your own company, then you generally don't get per month something like a wage. But you, of course, have to calculate your working time as a cost factor of your own company. And there you also then calculate something, well, if I would work at the same time not in my own company, then I maybe would earn 80,000 euros per year. And therefore, the costs in your working in your own company are, of course, 80,000 euros. No matter if you take 80,000 euros per year out of your company or not. And this is then the so-called concept of opportunity costs. I hope that you already have quite often the concept of opportunity costs. Yeah. And then, of course, we have some goods which we cannot count statistically. And there, these goods, because we don't get any information about it, or we do not get precise information about these goods and services, these goods really don't enter GDP. And this, of course, is black market, and I think I already said it. This could be roughly 10 to 12% of GDP. Well, these are, of course, rough estimates, but there are some papers which, by rule of thumb, say around 10% are produced in the black market. And of course, I don't know if you have already children or you will have children, then there is a great deal that you produce the service of educational service of your own children. And there is actually quite a difference if you look at, for example, at Germany or at France. And in France, for a long time, especially women could go to work because there was an official educational service that your children could go to the kindergarten. I think this is a word which also in French is the German word. And that they have time to go to work. And then, of course, for this educational service, we have a market price, you have wages of these people who work in these facilities. And then this educational service enters GDP. If your mom or dad stays at home, this doesn't enter GDP. And this is, of course, to criticize. Yes? Yeah, definitely. There are really many, especially services you do by your own, which do not enter GDP, and especially these services are highly important that a country is functioning. So this, of course, you have always to keep in mind that, especially here, in the definition we write all, but we cannot count all goods and services. So, educational or, of course, honorary posts. If you are the coach of some football team or anything else, then you obtain per year 200 euros or something like this. And of course, you are doing much more. Okay, so keep in mind this small word all stands behind it. And let's go on. What else? Finished, and this is of course also very important. This means that only value added is considered. So we do not want to count in GDP all intermediate consumption. What is the reason that we don't want to count this? Well, we want to have a variable which describes the economic performance of our country. And if we would count all these intermediate goods, then of course we would have a double count. Take for example a car. Of course, that a car can drive, at first you have, for example, to produce the wheels. And the car company is then buying the wheels from the intermediate company. But in the end, there is a car for, let's say, 30 or 40,000 euros. And within this number of 40,000 euros is, of course, the price, the production price also incorporated of the wheels. And if we then would separately count the wheels which were bought by the car company, then we would have a double count. And how large the intermediate consumption is in Germany or in general in industrial countries, this we will see in a minute. Then in short, of course, all goods and services. This just means all material and, so to speak, immaterial goods, which we say these are services. Within country borders, about this we have already talked about. So national consumption equals domestic consumption minus the factor income of non-citizens in the considered country and plus the factor income of citizens of from abroad. And in a specific period, I already mentioned it, this means in general per year, but we have also data per quarter. And this is that we have data for quarter. This is then also the reason that in general we have 4 general forecasts for GDP growth or economic growth in a country. So, and now we want to calculate GDP. How large is GDP? And this we can do from at least 3 sides. And the first one is, well, we just look at the production side. This just means that we count all the value added of all economic sectors. So we go to all production sectors, goods and services, of course, not only physical goods, also immaterial, and we put all this together and then minus, of course, the intermediate consumption, we should end up with GDP. So if we think about this approach from a theoretical point of view, then this would be just something like the supply side of our economy. Well, of course, if we have the supply side and we are organized in free markets, then there should be also a demand side. And of course, if we are producing anything, then via the production, we earn wages, we earn dividends from stock markets or something like this. So we have income from this production. And what we are doing with this income, we demand these goods. And this is then the expenditure approach. So this is all our final uses of goods and services. So this would be then, let's write it down here, private consumption. This is if in a company we demand something for investing, buying a new machine. Of course, all the government expenditures, and we are not alone in our world. So net exports and imports. This we had already when we looked at the circular flow, if you remember. Okay, so this would be the demand side. And then we can also have a look at a third point of view, and this is the so-called income approach. And I think in Introduction to Business Administration or in microeconomics or in, I don't know, investment or something like this, you also maybe have seen something like a production function. And in general, we are here in the lecture of macroeconomics. So if we take our input factors, then we do not go into detail. We also look at aggregate variables, and in general, then you say that production is just a function from capital and labor in general, in a very general way. Later on, when we start to look at models, especially at the neoclassical model, we will have also a deeper look in these production functions. But at this point, we are just in the description. So we look here at two production factors, capital, K, and labor, L. And then we can ask ourselves how much income comes from labor, so to speak, wages, and how much income comes from capital, profits, dividends, and so on. So we just look at the income of different production factors, and we make this here in a very aggregate way that we only look at capital and labor. So, and now we want to have a look just at the numbers, the actual numbers from last year, 2021, for Germany. And yeah, let's start with the production approach. And then we start just to look at all what we have produced last year. And there you see so that it is almost 7 billion euros. So quite a lot. And then we had here in the definition what means finished. So production minus the intermediate consumptions, and how large is the intermediate consumption in Germany. And then you see here that it is roughly 1/2 of the total production. So this one should also keep in mind how highly diversified we are in our Western Europe, United States, and so on, in these countries. Half of the total value is just intermediate consumption. So roughly half of total production is intermediate consumption. Well, and then we have to distinguish some numbers which, in general, would take that it is more or less the same, because if we subtract intermediate consumption from the total production, then we are not directly at GDP, but, this is still the German word, this has to be grow value added. Then we end up with grow value added. And how do we come to GDP. Then we make plus all the taxes and minus all subsidies. And this we had also already in the circular flow, if you remember. That from the household sector we had to pay taxes and we obtain transfers from the government, and also at the enterprise sector we pay, hopefully, taxes and we obtain subsidies from the government. And if we are doing this, then we end up at GDP of Germany. So Germany roughly 3.5 billion euros. If Germany is 3.5 billion euros, how much is then the European Union or the Eurozone? What do you think? How much GDP? 20 billion euros, US dollars, or yeah, or it was a time when we had an exchange rate of 1.25 last year or something. Right now it really dropped by 20%, by almost 30%, because of the development of the exchange rate. So the European Union GDP, I also have to look it up, but I think it's roughly 15 billion euros. Well, let's just have a look. This we can also do here. GDP. European Union. Trillion. Not. This could be quite good data. So almost. Here we are. So 17. 21. Okay. I think World Bank is a quite good source. So here we are in 21. So okay, then let's go to the expenditure approach. And there we see part of GDP, again, 3.5, 3.6 billion in Germany. Then we have here roughly, what is it, 55%. And these two, oops, government consumption and investment are, we can say, roughly the same. So more or less 20%. This is, of course, only roughly. This also differs from year to year, but not very much. We will see this in a minute, that during the last 10, 20 years, it stays more or less roughly the same. And if we take exports minus imports, then we have here roughly 200 billion. Oh, this has to be, because we are in English, this has to be trillion. This is quite hard for Germans. that we here then end up with roughly 5%. This will in 22, this will drop these because the export minus imports is really dropping down for Germany especially. Yes? Hmm? Okay, good. Yeah, good question. But we have our view always in the ex post view. So GDP, good question. GDP is an ex post view. So what has happened the last year? And then these has to be definitely the same. Because take, for example, investment. An investment, I have my own company maybe, and then I plan investments. And then something happens. And then I look after 1 year, I look behind what has happened and was my investment decision right? So maybe I have invested, so to speak, compared with my plans too much because something happened, some crazy guy started a war or something like this. But then, because I looking back in especially this variable investments, there I count then also unplanned investments. So because something happened which I had not in mind. And if you, maybe this is also a good point how to explain that it has to be the same. If we take just our price quantity diagram, then of course you have your supply side, you have your demand side, and what we look at is of course always the point where supply meets demand. So because we look what has happened all three approaches, if we get all the data we wanted to calculate, we have talked about that at some points. It is quite hard to get the data, but theoretically every side has to end up with the same number. But it is also a good question because then we start at the statistical offices to calculate GDP from all three sides, and of course we do not end at the same number. But then we estimate, well, where is data missing, and then of course what the number which you find then for GDP of Germany of 2021 is then of course also an estimate. But from a theoretical point of view, all these numbers has to be the same. Because we look what has happened the last year. So here we look in the past at the point where demand meets supply. Okay, and then let's have a look at the income approach. There, of course, we look at first in general at the wages, the compensations of employees, or if you own the company, then you hopefully make profits, or at a household, you are buying stocks and you get a dividend or something like this. And this would be then the corporate and investment income. And there, then we end up, if we count these both together, we don't end up with GDP, but with the so-called aggregate variable national income. But quite often, if you go to the media, then national income, let's take another color here. Oops. Then national income, grow value added, and grow domestic product are more or less taken as the same as variables to measure economic performance. But here in this table, then you see that all these are a little bit different numbers. But anyhow, how do we come to GDP? At first, we have to calculate plus taxes on production and imports and subsidies. So we come then to the net national income, and then you see here 700 billion euros. This is quite a lot, and these are the aggregated depreciations in the whole country altogether. And this is also, if you go to some company, you go to the balance sheet there, then of course also you have to keep in mind that there is this really important point of depreciations over time. And per 1 year, this is quite a lot compared with the total value of GDP. And then we are, again, we have already talked about this at co-national product, and then we have to balance this with the primary income from abroad and end up at GDP. Okay, then let's have a little bit deeper look at production, income, and expenditure approach. And we start with the production approach, at which sectors we look in an aggregated way. Here, GVA, grow value added. So all these percent parts, 1%, 54, 24, and so on, they are always calculated not relative to GDP, but relative to grow value added. And then we can say that in Germany, and this is quite important if we compare Germany with other countries which are looking quite the same, so with UK, with France, with Italy or something like this, then this part of almost 25% in the classical manufacturing and production sector, this is a quite high number in industrial countries. So if you look at UK, I think there it is something like 15 or 16%. And also in France, it is less than 20%. So if we look at the economically large countries in the world, then Germany has the highest part of these classical manufacturing and production sector in the world. And this is maybe was quite funny. So if we go 20 years back in time, then all the people looked at this part, whoa, 25% in, so to speak, old production. This is really worse, or this is really bad for economic performance. So there was at the cover of The Economist around 2000 or so, there was a picture with an old, ill man, and this was Germany. So, and then time went by. 10 years later, we had the global financial and economic crisis. And again, we looked at UK, at Italy, at Spain, at Germany. What are they economically doing? And then especially we looked at the UK, and there we had this especially huge financial services sector. Well, and then the reason why was the economic performance during this crisis so bad in the United Kingdom? Then it was the reason was then, whoa, you don't have any old production anymore. You have only these financial services. And then we looked at Germany and why we performed quite well during this crisis. Then the expert said, well, the reason is because we have these old production sector. Well, and now we are in the energy crisis. And since in these sectors we need very much energy, again, we say, well, maybe the next month or the next years, 1 or 2 years at least, Germany will have a problem because of this high part of old production, and this is really energy intensive. So we have always, we cannot say this is good or bad. In general, we always have to look at the framework and the time in which we are living. So then, of course, construction sector, roughly 5%, or last year 6%. This is a bit less compared to other, especially in Europe, economic countries. If you look there, for example, during the financial crisis, for example, in Spain, part of the production sector was around 20%. And this was then, of course, one of the main reasons because why the economic performance in Spain really dropped. Because they built and built and built, and nobody needed all these buildings. But at first, the economic performance, 2005, 6, and so on, was really good because building or constructing a building just means that you are producing anything, and all these enters GDP, and therefore, if you look at the economic performance of Spain around from 2003 to 2006, this was, so to speak, in economic growth numbers, really good. But behind this was this really huge construction sector. This is right now really a really big question because we talked, I think, when I was still at university, we made a seminar, I think it was around 2003 or 2004. And there one professor 15 years ago said, well, China has a really huge problem in its construction sector. Well, but it lasted now 10 years in really, so to speak, really good economic performance. But right now we maybe really can say, because there are, I think, 2 or 3 really huge investment banks which are invested highly in the construction sector, that they have really huge problems. So we will see, because the forecast for China is right now that the growth rates this year will be not more than 3%. And for a still developing country, 3% is really, really is a really, really low number. If you compare this with the last 10 years, then the growth rates in China were around 7 to 10%. So economic growth in China seems to drop by 50% this year. Well, of course, if you look at their zero COVID strategy, then of course you cannot produce. Okay, and at the last sector, the wholesale and retail trade sector, so roughly 15% we can keep in mind. And from a historic perspective, if you look at my historical example of the circular flow, 300 years ago, of course, the agricultural sector was more or less the total production in our country, 90% or something like this. And 300 years later, we had 1% relative to grow value added. So then let's have a look, and I am always a friend to have a longer perspective, not only to look 10 or 20 years behind. Here it is roughly 50%. And then you see that in Germany, more or less, the part of the construction sector is roughly stable around 5%. And also, if you take the retail sector, also roughly stable 15%. But then if you take these 50-year perspective, there we have this dramatic change that although compared to other countries, we have a, so to speak, deindustrialization also in Germany, it drops here from roughly 40% to 25%. And of course, the services sector increased highly from 30% to roughly 55%. And this change you see more or less in all developed countries during the 50 years. But the change is not that large in Germany compared to the other large countries, compared to United States, UK, Italy, and France, if we take only the large countries. But then, of course, we also see the last 10 or 20 years, this is more or less stable, and this will be really interesting if the digitalization again pushes the service sector even more up. But we will see what the digital transformation will mean to our economic performance. So then let's go to the expenditure approach. There we have already talked about the parts that this was roughly 55%, this roughly 20%, and this also roughly all together roughly this were 20%, sorry. Again, so this 55, here's my rubber, here, 55, this 20%, this in total, roughly 20%, and the external contribution, roughly 5%. And then, if we have a deeper look at the investments, then you should have a look especially at the changes in inventories. And this will also be very interesting in the actual situation. This is always very interesting in a phase of a crisis. And you already mentioned this, are the supply side and the demand side. Why do we end up at the same number? Well, there are unplanned investments that you have planned an investment and you could not sell half of your production or something like this. Then your goods are still there. They count for GDP, but you haven't sold them. So, and if you look that we have inventories of 55, now it's billion euros. And we say that we have seen that GDP is roughly 3,500 billion euros. Then just keep in mind, if every other variable would stay the same, we have only a change in inventories of, let's take now not only not the 55, but let's say inventories change by 50 billion euros. What would be the growth rate of this country? Then we would have just a change. Only inventories should have changed. All other should have been the same. 50 divided by 3,500. And if we take this times 3, then it's roughly 150 divided by 10,000. And though we would end roughly at a number of a growth rate of 1.5%. So especially in crisis, we have to look at this number, because if we have a drop, or after the crisis we have a huge increase, let's say during the financial crisis we had a drop of between 5 and 6% in the economy in Germany, and during the Corona crisis the drop was almost 4%. And if we look then at the numbers, then almost half of it, the reason was just the change of inventories. And also, especially in the financial crisis in 2010 and 2011, we had growth rates in Germany of roughly 4%. Also there, the main reasons was just the change in the other direction of inventories. So sometimes economic growth is driven from actually only a small number. And this is also important when you interpret this aggregate number of economic growth. And also one has to say, if you ask the guys in the statistical offices, where does this number come from? Then they have to admit, well, we cannot ask every company, what are your changes in inventories? Actually, we do not get these numbers. This is really only a rough estimate. And if this is only a rough estimate, but this number, especially in crisis, more or less drives half of the economic performance, then you know how large the error is, or your band around your point forecast. This you have also to keep in mind. And also, if you look at the data, then you see that the data of the last years always are changing the next 10 years. So if you look, for example, at the data for the drop in 2009 in the financial crisis, then I think we started with minus 4.6, and then we went up to minus 5.8. Then 5 years ago it was around 5%, and I think the actual number is again minus 5.6%. Because the data is especially during a crisis, only a rough estimate. So, and then let's also have a look here at the longer view, again 50 years back in time, but then you see more or less all numbers are almost stable. So we do not have this dramatic change here, which we had in the production approach or the supply side. So if we look at the demand side, we are more or less stable with one distinction. And there we can have a look at this time period. Because especially in this time period, more or less exports and imports were balanced. And actually, I also have to admit, I'm from a theoretical point of view, I'm not allowed to draw some kind of this diagram. What is the reason? Because this is, it is not wrong, but it is questionable to draw such a diagram. If you keep in mind that there we have the difference between exports and imports. This is the yellow line. What could happen to the yellow line? Yep. Yes, of course. Yeah, and then you have minus 5% or something like this. And especially, so it is hard to plot such a diagram for the United States because they have really huge minus at the external contribution because imports in the United States are much larger than exports of the United States. But for Germany, I think in 99 or in 2000 there was a really slight minus sign in front, exports minus imports, but it was only some million euros. But what could be the reason that we had here 10 years in Germany where exports more or less balanced imports? And maybe you know that, Germany is always called the champion of exports in the world, maybe together with China, number 1 or number 2. Didn't we export during this time? Yeah.
Maybe we only exported into our own country, namely the east side, because 9
This goes in the right direction. Of course, we started to build up our 5 new little nice countries. Just yesterday, we had our unification day. This goes in the right direction, but it wasn't the case that we only built ourselves. We still had our export industry. If we look at the development of exports during this time, they went really huge up because this was also the time when the communism collapsed, the Soviet Union has collapsed. So we had really many new markets. So exports really went up, but you are totally right. We built up the new countries, and this meant
what we produce, we export.
yeah,
Just like the previous years,
yeah,
we have we needed to
yes.
maybe that
This building up definitely, yeah,
is still needed to be
yeah.
the stuff.
And also we had to build up the industry in the German, the former German Democratic Republic. So we had really a huge investment demand during this time, and therefore exports didn't drop, but imports really went up during this time. And this was the reason that we had this roughly 10 years with the balanced external contribution. So during this time, imports for building up former GDR went up. This doesn't mean that exports dropped. Yep. Not only the investment, it's also, it's of course an investment of the government, but also a private investment. Yeah. Oh yeah, this is also a good question. So we have government consumption, but here this is both private and public investment. Well, we have the data that we also can divide this in these two numbers, but I didn't want it to go in too much detail. Okay, then 5 minutes we have left, and we can end up today with the income approach. And this we will keep quite easy, that we only look at the corporate income and the wages of employees. And if we only have two numbers, then of course, if we have one number, we have also the part of the other number, 100% minus, and therefore we look, so to speak, only at one number, the so-called labor share, where we take the compensation of employees. And here also we are not dividing by GDP, but we are dividing by national income. If we go back here at this slide, then you see this is the part. This is a number where we calculating the part of the compensation of employees. Okay, and here we can say that this is roughly 70% if you look at this here. So you see this is quite volatile between 65 and 75%, but actually this is not very surprising, because especially if you look at stock investments, then of course stock investments are highly volatile. And if the stock market goes up, or if it drops by 10 or 20%, then of course these labor share has also to follow the volatility of more or less the stock markets. And here you have also this drop here during the financial crisis, and if you remember, stock market also went then really down, and then we had the coming up. So roughly we can say labor share is around 70%. Okay, done. That is what I want to do with you today. And next time we start then talking in more detail about economic growth, inflation, labor market, and so on. So thank you very much for today.